Hi, my name is Brian Apavu. I am a neurologist with an interest in philosophy, the mind, and living the examined life. Today, I want to expand upon the topic of consciousness with a focus on our evolution to our modern theories to the neural correlates of consciousness. For the longest time, dating back to ancient Greece, the great philosophers have recognized that consciousness is dependent on the head. A common question investigated was where consciousness was located. Herophilus, a physician of Alexandria in ancient Greece, performed human dissections and made detailed studies of the nervous system. He did argue that the ventricles of the brain were central to cognition and consciousness, marking one of the earliest ventricular theories, the ventricles being the fluid space within the brain. He also distinguished between sensory and motor nerves, further supporting the brain as a center of thought. Galen, through dissections and medical practice, argued that the brain ventricles were central to consciousness, reasoning that nerves connected sensory organs and muscles back to them. The pre Socratic atomist philosopher Democritus held that the soul, and thus consciousness, was composed of special fine spherical atoms dispersed throughout the body, not localized in one organ. Consciousness for him was a material phenomena tied to atomic motion with no single seat. Epicurus, the ancient Greek philosopher and founder of Epicureanism, tied mental life to bodily sensation. Some sources suggest that he considered the stomach as the seat of emotion and consciousness, partly because of the strong visceral sensations associated with fear, hunger, and desire. More precisely, he placed the hegemonicon, or ruling part, of the soul in the chest area. In the 3rd century BC, Stoic philosophers such as Xenos and Chrysippus argued that the hegemonicon, that ruling center of the soul, was located in the heart. They thought that the heart was seen as the seat of the pneuma, or vital breath like substance, which animate thought and perception, and thus consciousness was within and around the heart. Empedocles, a Greek pre Socratic philosopher, poet, and mystic from modern day Sicily, believed that perception and consciousness were linked to blood. Specifically, he thought that the blood around the heart was the seat of thought and sensation, since it was the purest and most balanced mixture of the four elements. Strato of Lampsacus suggested that the region between the eyebrows was the center of sensation and consciousness. Likely, this reflected an intuition about the location of major sense organs such as the eyes, nose, and ears converging near that area. Plato located this rational soul in the head, aligning the brain with higher thought and immortality. He divided the soul into three parts: the rational in the head, the spirit in the chest, and the appetite in the abdomen. Consciousness for him was linked to the immaterial rational soul, with the brain being its seat. Aristotle opposed Plato here. He placed the soul in the heart, considering it the seat of sensation, movement, and thought. The brain, in his view, was essentially a radiator to cool the blood. While we now see this as wrong, it shows how different conceptions of physiology shaped where thinkers place consciousness. Hippocrates was one to argue that the seat of sensation and thought was in the brain. In On the Sacred Diseases, he rejected supernatural explanations for epilepsy and claimed that the brain was responsible for intelligence, perception, and emotion. In the 11th century, Asavenna, a Persian philosopher physician, suggested that the inner senses, like imagination, memory, and estimation, were housed in different ventricles of the brain. This reinforced the idea that specific brain areas corresponded to elements of consciousness. In the 17th century, Rene Descartes is famous for the concept of dualism, a non physical mind interacting with a physical brain. He located this interaction in the pineal gland, reasoning that it was singular, unlike paired brain structures, and thus could unify conscious experience. While incorrect physiologically, his efforts to pinpoint a neural structure for consciousness was groundbreaking at the time. In the 18th and 19th century, there were phrenologists, Joseph Gall and Johann Spurzheim, who proposed that mental faculties, including awareness, were localized to different brain organs and could be read from skull bumps. While this was later shown to be pseudoscientific, this seeded the idea of the concept of localization and function within the brain. Later in the mid 19th century, Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke were physicians and anatomists who made landmark discoveries about the localization of language in their brain. Their work laid the foundation for modern neurolinguistics and neuropsychology. Language studies showed that damaged areas to Broca's area impaired speech production, while Wernicke's area affected comprehension. This provided strong evidence that specific cognitive processes and potentially consciousness itself and its functions could be localized to specific cortical regions. In the 19th century, Gustav Frisch and Edward Hitzig demonstrated that stimulating cortical areas in dogs produced movements, showing direct brain behavior relationships. And then in the 20th century, the neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield demonstrated that during epilepsy surgeries, he could stimulate the cortex of awake patients. These patients reported vivid experiences, such as hearing voices, reliving memories, feeling sensations. This reinforced the notion that elements of consciousness, that being perception, memory, and awareness, were tied to cortical activation. Later studies in the 19th and 20th century helped look and evaluate for coma and the role of the thalamus and the cortex in terms of arousal. And this expanded upon our neurologic correlates of consciousness. In the late 19th century, John Hewlings Jackson argued that consciousness was the sum total of activity in both cerebral hemispheres. This meant that no localized structure could account for awareness, but instead the hemisphere as a whole generated it. As a correlate, he sort of recognized that consciousness could be abolished by damage to both hemispheres. Lesions restricted to one hemisphere should not, in his view, eliminate consciousness altogether. In the early 20th century, the Viennese neurologist and psychiatrist Konstantin von Economo demonstrated during the epidemic of encephalitis lethargica that there were distinct wake promoting regions in the upper brainstem and sleep promoting regions in the anterior hypothalamus, laying the foundation for modern arousal systems concepts. In 1929, Hans Berger, the founder of and father of electroencephalography, introduced electroencephalography, or what we call EEG, showing patterns of brain waves that correlated with levels of consciousness. In the 1930s, Frederick Bremer, a Belgian neurophysiologist best known for his pioneering work on the brain's role in sleep, arousal, and consciousness, evaluated careful transection studies in animals that provided some of our first experimental evidence that the brainstem plays a critical role in wakefulness. In 1949, two neurophysiologists, Giuseppe Maruzzi and Horace Magon, had a landmark experiment where they demonstrated that stimulating the midbrain reticular formation could awaken animals, leading to the concept that we know of now as the ascending reticular activating system. Now, in today's age, Plum and Posner's diagnosis of stupor and coma remains a seminal textbook for neurologists who have an interest in the study of coma and disorders of consciousness. In this textbook, it described consciousness as the state of full awareness of the self and one's relationship to the environment. Now, clinically at the bedside, consciousness is assessed by how a patient responds to the examiner. Importantly, someone may be conscious but appear unresponsive if they lack motor output, such as something we refer to as cognitive motor dissociation, where they which we'll talk about in another video in more depth. Now, with Plum and Posner, they categorize consciousness into two major concepts. One is content, which is all cognitive and affective functions mediated by the cerebral cortex, such as things like memory, language, and perception. And then arousal, the overall level of cortical activity maintained by specific brainstem and thalamic pathways and that represent the ascending arousal system or ascending reticular activating system. Now, Plum and Posner's diagnosis for stupor and coma is written for clinicians, and as such, it has been focused much more on that which we can induce from clinical observations and clinical descriptions, carrying less of an emphasis on the qualia, the internal qualia of consciousness that we experience. Evidence from animal models and other clinical studies show that integrity of the ascending reticular activating system is critical for mechanisms involving arousal. This has been probably the most important historical system that critical care neurologists and intensivists think about when they see patients that are in a coma. But for most of us and most individuals in the population, there is an interest in what makes us conscious as humans. And this is where we need to expand upon that component of content. At present, researchers don't agree on a single definition of consciousness. For some, particularly clinicians, consciousness is about function. Cognitive processing and behavior is made possible by being conscious. For others, such as philosophers and psychologists, there is a focus on inquiry of the subjective experience. What is to be like you? Consciousness is subject to the fallacy of reification, where different people mean something different when they define consciousness, and this leads to disagreement among different theories when differing experts are not talking about the same phenomena when they debate about the same word, that being consciousness. There are a few families of theories being empirically tested in our modern concept of consciousness, and I'll go over a number of them. Higher order theories of consciousness propose that conscious experience arises when information, such as visual stimuli, is not just represented in sensory areas, but is re represented in higher order brain regions. In other words, for a perception to become conscious, the brain must form a meta representation of that perception in areas specialized for synthesizing content from multiple regions, such as the prefrontal cortex or associative cortices. Higher order theories of consciousness focus on metacognition and introspection as key components of the conscious experience. The higher order theories of consciousness are especially appealing to philosophers because the theory aligns with intuitions about self-awareness. That being, consciousness is not just having a state, but knowing that you have it. Integrated information theory is one of the most ambitious and debated frameworks in consciousness science. It was developed by Giulio Tononi and colleagues. Integration information theory starts from the intuition that consciousness is both highly differentiated and highly integrated. It's highly differentiated in the sense that every conscious experience is unique and specific, such as seeing red or blue, but it also is highly integrated, that all parts of an experience are unified, that you don't just see shapes and colors separately, but as one coherent percept. Integrated information theory proposes that the amount of consciousness a system has corresponds to how much information it integrates. And this is quantified in this theory by a measure called phi. Tononi outlined several axioms of experience in corresponding postulates for physical systems. There is intrinsic existence, that consciousness exists with its own perspective, not from an external observer. Composition, experiences are structured and they have parts and relationships. Information, experiences are specific, they rule out many alternatives. Integration, experiences are unified, not reducible to independent parts. And exclusion, each conscious experience has definite borders in space and time. A system that satisfies these postulates to a high degree generates consciousness proportional to its phi value. Now, integration information theory defines consciousness as integrated information and ties it to measures including phi, making it unique among theories providing a quantitative structural account. It is widely respected for its ambition, but it's also sharply criticized for its testability and leaning towards panpsychism. Global neuronal workspace theory is one of the leading scientific frameworks for explaining how and why information becomes conscious. It built on earlier ideas from Bernard Barr's global workspace model and was later developed into a neural theory by Dr. Stanislas Dehaene and colleagues. The core idea in global neuronal workspace theory is that the brain has many specialized processors, such as visual, auditory, motor, semantic processing, and processors, working largely unconscious and in parallel. Consciousness arises when one of these processors' outputs is selected for global broadcast to a distributed network, which we refer to as the global neuronal workspace. Once information is broadcast, it becomes accessible to multiple systems simultaneously: memory, decision making, planning, language, introspection. In short, consciousness is information globally available across the brain. In terms of neural architecture, the workspace is implemented by long distance pyramidal neurons with widespread axons linking prefrontal, parietal, and cingulate cortices. Ignition occurs when concept perception is associated with a sudden nonlinear ignition of activity. Once a threshold is crossed, widespread synchronous activation occurs across these frontoparietal networks. You have conscious and unconscious processing that are differentiated. Unconscious processing represents local, fast, encapsulated processing, such as subliminal visual processing in the occipital cortex, where somebody may not consciously be aware of a new stimuli in front of them because it was so rapid and quick, but their brain does light up or activate to it. And then this is differentiated from conscious processing, which is slower, global, sustained, and integrated across regions where a subject will become aware of the stimuli that was novel in front of them. There is experimental evidence that supports global neuronal workspace theory. Mass priming studies show that subliminal stimuli can influence behavior without entering consciousness, but they fail to trigger sustained global activity. Neuroimaging studies and electroencephalographic studies using functional MRI, EEG, magnetoencephalogram show that concept perception correlates with widespread late activity across prefrontal parietal regions, not just early sensory activity. Intracranial recordings of humans show that concept perception is linked to high frequency synchronization in the gamma band across distributed sites. And patients with disorders of consciousness often show disrupted frontoparietal connectivity, and the recovery of this sort of activity correlates with restored long distance communication over time. And we'll go more into that in a separate video in terms of the clinical role of some of these theories and emerging ways that we're studying and treating consciousness. Now, global neural workspace theory argues that consciousness is useful because of a number of things. It allows flexible coordination across many specialized processors in the brain. It supports working memory or holding information online. It enables serial decision making and reasoning in contrast to unconscious parallel processing. In comparison to the integrated information theory, global neuronal workspace theory is about functional accessibility and global sharing, not intrinsic causal structure. Integration information theory places the seat of consciousness in posterior cortices, whereas global neuronal workspace theory seems to emphasize frontoparietal workspace neurons. And unlike higher order theories of consciousness, global neuronal workspace theory doesn't require higher order thoughts. It requires global access. Higher order thoughts Higher order theories of consciousness focus on metacognition, whereas global neural workspace theory is about availability for use. Another important modern day theory of consciousness is the recurrent processing theory of consciousness. This is another major contender championed by Victor Lamy and colleagues. It offers a more localized bottom up, top down account of consciousness compared to more global accounts, such as the global neuronal workspace theory or the abstract quantifications in integration information theory. The core idea of recurrent processing theory is that consciousness arises when sensory information undergoes recurrent feedback or processing between lower level sensory areas, such as the V1 of the cortex, of the occipital cortex, and higher level associative areas, such as V4, the inferotemporal cortex, or parietal cortex. Feed forward processing alone is not sufficient to generate consciousness. There are initial sweeps of visual input throughout the hierarchy that can support unconscious perception, but it is conscious perception that requires recurrent loops that stabilize and integrate information. Crucially, global broadcasting is not necessary for conscious experience in recurrent processing theory. Consciousness can occur within localized sensory circuits as long as recurrent feedbacks exist. There are feed-forward sweeps. Early fast activity under 100 milliseconds propagates up the visual hierarchy if there's visual stimuli from the retina to the lateral geniculate nucleus to the V1 cortex in the cortical lobe the occipital lobe to V2 to V4 and to the inferotemporal cortex. And this can support unconscious discrimination, such as blind sight or subliminal priming. But later, after 100 milliseconds from stimulus, there's recurrent feedback where higher areas send feedback signals to lower areas, creating loops that amplify, integrate, and bind features to a unified concept. The recurrent interaction creates stability in the neural representation, the hallmark of conscious perception. There are EEG studies and magnetoencephalographic studies that support this theory. These studies show that concept perception is associated with reentrant activity and recurrent synchronization between early and higher visual regions. Just like with global neuronal workspace theory, The recurrent processing theory has experimental evidence behind it. Visual masking studies exist where stimuli is presented too briefly with mask interrupts, feed-forward sweeps, and these aren't not consciously seen, but when recurrent processing allowed, the perception does emerge. Patients with V1 lesions can discriminate stimuli unconsciously, which suggests feed-forward processes are preserved in extrastriate cortex, but there is a lack of recurrent loops through V1, so they don't actually consciously perceive things with this sort of blind sight. And then in patients with inattentional blindness, there's studies that show that stimuli can be processed unconsciously, but they fail to reach recurrent stabilization. So I've discussed a number of modern theories of consciousness that exist in the modern day. There are lots of ongoing electrophysiologic, neuroimaging, and psychological studies that are working to sort of support some of the hypotheses that come around with these different theories. And we exist in a world where there's a lot of debate among scientists about these different theories and what's valid or invalid. And there's something we have to recognize because, again, we're dealing with the fallacy of reification when we talk about consciousness. Everybody looks at it in a different way. We have to remember a number of key important things here. There is a famous biostatistician, George E.P. Box, who said, "No theory is accurate, but some may be useful." This is really important in the regard to our theories of consciousness. The theories of consciousness that we have, much like with the fallacy of reification, is a lot like the parable of blind men feeling the elephant. Each individual feels a portion of the elephant that they cannot see as a whole, and they come up with a theory of what they feel. But unless they see the elephant as a whole, they're not able to put the whole concept together. The nature of theories of consciousness is much like this parable. We can find value in the development of theories and non-competing theories when we take this all into account. And we also can harness the increasing knowledge of what we have to solve the problems in front of us. It's not necessarily what theory is more correct than the other or which one necessarily wins or loses, but how we use an expanded array of information and how we expand our knowledge regarding consciousness to be able to solve problems in our modern day. So I hope you enjoyed this exploration of the modern theories of consciousness and where we came from a historical perspective. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe it. I hope you have a great day.